All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Rapid Readout, The Future of FEMA. I'm Dan Bursett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute. The idea behind a Rapid Readout briefing like this is that if you give us at EESI 30 minutes, we will give you what you need to know about a specific climate, clean energy, or environmental topic in the news. Of course, our regular briefings will continue. We just had one last week about efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the industrial sector, and we have 3 briefings next week as part of our comprehensive coverage of COP30. One on Tuesday, November 4th, about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and what to expect at the upcoming negotiations set to take place in Brazil, followed by one about the Global Cooling Pledge on Wednesday, and one about international trade and climate policy on Thursday. Visit us online at eesi.org and subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions, to keep up with everything that we have going on here at EESI. And especially during COP30, you have to subscribe to COP30 Dispatch, our daily newsletter about the UN climate negotiations. The first issue of COP30 Dispatch actually comes out tomorrow to start sharing our resources. So as we get started, this is a little bit of a different format from our normal briefings, but we built in some interactivity because we would like to hear from you and take your questions about FEMA reform and federal emergency management. To share your thoughts, join our poll, and you can do that by either using the QR code on the screen, or you can go to menti.com, that's menti.com, and type in the code at the top of the screen. Once there, you'll be able to give your input. It's all anonymous, but we will see the overall results on the screen, which are starting to come in right now. Let's just give that a couple seconds to see which way it goes. There's also a little bit of a delay, so if it looks like I'm just sitting there looking at nothing, it's because there's a little bit of delay. Great. Thanks to everyone who's logging into menti.com. All right, well, let's keep that one. Those results will continue to come in, but let's move on a little bit. Today, our topic is the status of reform efforts for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. As you might already know, the administration and Congress are considering changes to pre-disaster preparedness, disaster response, and post-disaster recovery. You can share with us everything you're especially curious about and then rank each one of those items by using the Mentimeter. So again, let's just give that a couple seconds for these results to come in. And our presenter and I will incorporate this feedback when we get to the Q&A in particular. All right, well, to everyone who said status of FEMA reform, good, you're in the right place, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. All right, very cool. Thank you to everyone who's submitting responses. So the goal of this session is to provide an overview of the FEMA reforms under consideration, especially the bipartisan Fixing Emergency Management for Americans Act of 2025, and discuss what it could mean for states and communities overcoming a recent disaster or preparing for the next. You can also send us questions for our Q&A after our panelists, and you can do that by following us on social media at EESI Online. You can also send us an email to ask, that's ask, at eesi.org. So we'll take all of those responses either from the Mentimeter or from the Q&A, or from the email or from social media, and we'll incorporate all of that into the question and answer period, which will be after our presenter goes. Great. Thanks for all of the responses so far. All right. Without any further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker for today. Joel Scata is a senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, where he focuses on issues related to preparing the United States for water-related impacts of climate change, including federal flood policy reform and adapting to sea level rise. He has over 10 years of experience in advancing federal and state climate resilience policies, and he's about the best person we could have on our panel today. Joel, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to you, turn my video off, watch your presentation, and then I'll be back after your presentation for Q&A.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on today. As Dan mentioned, I'm a senior attorney at NRDC, a part of our climate adaptation division. I do a lot of work on federal policy reform, in particular disaster management policy reform, and have spent the last 10 years looking at FEMA and reforms to FEMA that could be pushed forward to make disaster management and disaster resilience more efficient and effective for Americans. And so what I want to talk about today is, disasters like floods, hurricanes, and wildfires are increasing, along with the associated damages and suffering. As you can see on this chart, the number of billion-dollar disaster events, which are just events that have cost more than $1 billion, have greatly increased, adjusting for inflation over the last several years. And the federal government, particularly FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, plays a central role in helping the nation prepare and respond to those disasters. Now, there's broad agreement that FEMA should be reformed. It can be slow to respond to disasters, it can be overly bureaucratic, and the aid doesn't always reach the most vulnerable populations. But FEMA is still very vital to disaster response and recovery in the United States. And so for this brief rapid readout, I'm going to discuss the history and background of FEMA, the current approach to federal disaster management and recent changes, and then really highlight proposed reforms, including the legislation that was mentioned earlier, the Fixing Emergency Management for Americans Act, or FEMA Act, currently before the House. So for some background on FEMA, FEMA was created in 1979 when President Carter signed an executive order basically consolidating multiple disaster-related responsibilities that had been scattered across more than 100 federal agencies. Before FEMA, disaster relief in the United States was often reactive, fragmented, and inconsistent, and it left many states and communities without a clear federal coordination or a clear role in how aid was going to come to them. So FEMA's founding really represented a major step forward towards a unified natural approach to disaster management. In its early years, the agency focused largely on civil defense during the Cold War, but major natural disasters like Hurricanes Hugo and Andrew in the 80s and 90s kind of exposed weaknesses in response and coordination. And those events led to reforms that really professionalized FEMA's operations and elevated its role in federal emergency management. After the September 11th attacks, FEMA was brought under the Department of Homeland Security in 2003 and shifted its mission to include terrorism preparedness alongside natural disaster response. And then in 2005, Hurricane Katrina revealed some really deep systematic failures and prompted further reforms and that would emphasize mitigation, resilience, and equity. And the policy changes that followed Katrina and other major disasters such as Harvey, Irma, Maria, Sandy, were really hard won. They took years to develop and implement. In many cases, that work is still ongoing. So some of the reform of FEMA and FEMA leadership in the last few decades was that FEMA was elevated in visibility and resources with a much greater emphasis on leadership accountability. The post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act of 2006, I know that's a bit of a mouthful, created eligibility requirements for FEMA administrators. So I'm sure a lot of people remember from Katrina that there was the heck of the job brownie quote when responding to the emergency manager during the Katrina response that really showed the lack of experience that the emergency managers for FEMA had before this new act. And this new act put in requirements that the administrator of FEMA have background experience in emergency management, disaster response and recovery. And there was other reforms to the Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, or the Stafford Act, that allowed for faster federal intervention. And those have all been ongoing for the last several decades. One of the big things that happened was that state and local governments were encouraged to develop all hazard plans and conduct large-scale simulation exercises. And another important thing that's occurred is that funding for pre-disaster mitigation projects like levees, flood protection, resilient infrastructure has increased and has broadened FEMA's mission. In 2020, during the first Trump administration, FEMA launched its flagship hazard mitigation program, which was the Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program for reducing risk. And that program has been really beneficial. Since 2020, it has directed over $1 billion annually to resiliency projects like floodplain restoration or wildfire mitigation. And the benefit cost ratio for taxpayers is 6-to-1, meaning for every dollar spent, there's about $6 in savings. And so that's, I think, a quick and dirty overview of FEMA and what it works on. And now I can kind of get into more of the current state of affairs. So what happens when a disaster strikes? Is FEMA the first line of defense? And the answer is no. So when a disaster strikes, whether it's a hurricane or a wildfire or an earthquake, FEMA's mission really is to help people before and during and after the event. And the agency's intervention occurs after a state or tribal government requests federal assistance. So it's really states and localities that are the first line of defense for disasters. But once a locality or a state realizes that the magnitude of the disaster has exceeded their capacity, they submit a request to the president asking for a disaster declaration. And once the president issues a disaster declaration, that's when FEMA activates and its response framework and mobilizes personnel and support. It really plays a kind of like a backup role and a coordinating role to help these communities and these localities recover for disasters that far exceed their capacity. And it can do that through mutual aid compacts that allow it to help. It helps run so communities from one state can assist a community in another state during a disaster. And at the really heart of the response is coordination. The agency deploys incident management assistance teams to assess needs on the ground, open disaster recovery centers, and coordinate with agencies like the Red Cross and National Guard or other federal partners. And through programs like public assistance and individual assistance, FEMA really provides critical aid, such as temporary housing, debris removal, and funding to repair roads, schools, and hospitals after a disaster strikes that exceeds the capacity of the local community or the state. But in recent years, FEMA hasn't really stopped at immediate relief. It also focuses on resilience. Helping communities rebuild stronger through hazard mitigation grant programs, updated flood maps, and infrastructure hardening projects. And all these interventions really aim to not only restore what was lost, but to reduce future risks of disasters and reduce future expenses for taxpayers in the way that funding goes out the door to help communities recover. In the current administration, there's been a lot of talk about reforming FEMA. There's been a FEMA Review Council set up, as well as many actions that the administration has taken that in some aspects have made the provision of aid a little more erratic. And that's not to say that states and localities don't need to do more. That's definitely true. States need to do more to be more resilient, but the elimination of FEMA is not the answer because of the coordinating role it plays among states and localities at the national level to help aid get there where it needs to be. And in some of the reforms that we're seeing play out or events that we see play out have kind of made the distribution of disaster aid right now really erratic, with unexpected denials of major disaster requests, delayed approvals for major disaster requests which hamper recovery. There's been a defunding of various hazard mitigation grant programs, which have been very bipartisan because of how beneficial they are and reach a wide variety of communities. And so these all combine to make FEMA in the relatively last, I'd say, several months, much more inefficient in reducing their capacity. So in response, there's been some work to reform FEMA at the congressional level, which I'm going to talk about now. Next slide, please. So at the congressional level, there's been a lot of effort to reform FEMA because, as I mentioned before, it does need to be reformed. Yet, while it's improved greatly over the last several decades, especially since Hurricane Katrina, more needs to be done. But eliminating the agency isn't going to solve the problems that we're facing. What really needs to happen is that FEMA needs to be more efficient and made more effective in terms of how it gets aid to communities, especially vulnerable communities. And so this past summer, a bipartisan bill, the FEMA Act, was introduced. Representatives Graves and Larson introduced this act in the House T&I committee, and it's been really impactful. It has a lot of good aspects to the bill that would make FEMA more efficient and effective. So one of the things that it does, as you can see on the screen, is that it elevates the FEMA to an independent cabinet agency that directly reports to the president. When FEMA was placed under DHS in the early 2000s, it kind of impacted some of its ability to be independent and to respond to disasters effectively and quickly. And so there's a push to have it go back to being an independent cabinet agency so it can be more nimble. The FEMA Act would also require the administrator of FEMA to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate and meet specified qualifications that were really more specific than what was already established in the Stafford Act during post-Katrina about the emergency management experience that the administrator needs to make sure that who's ever in charge of FEMA understands the role that the agency is supposed to play and understands exactly what it should be doing in terms of helping communities recover from disasters. The FEMA Act also has proposed some major reforms to how federal disaster assistance programs occur under the Stafford Act. Including shifting public assistance program, which is the program that reimburses basically communities for disaster recovery. So like if a hurricane comes through and it's exceeded the capacity of the state to respond and they get a disaster declaration, public assistance might be issued not only help with debris removal, but to help rebuild damaged schools or hospitals. But the way it's currently structured is a reimbursement framework, which means it can take an incredibly long time for communities and states to get reimbursed from the money they put up front. And it just really slows down the process. So one of the things that the FEMA Act would do that is beneficial is it would shift the public assistance program from purely reimbursement based to more of a grant model with estimated cost project grants to speed up infrastructure repair and building, make it more efficient. Another great thing that the Act would be doing, and this is not to say that we are backing the Act. These are just some things I want to share that the Act does, is that it creates a universal disaster application for individuals. So one of the criticisms of FEMA is that it's really bureaucratic for an individual to apply for aid. There's multiple different programs out there. If you don't have the appropriate access to the internet or to other aspects for requesting assistance, it can be really hard to get the aid that you need as an individual to recover after a disaster. And what this act would do is create basically a universal disaster application for individuals and households to streamline access to assistance programs and simplify eligibility. It also, the act would incentivize, or the bill would incentivize hazard mitigation by authorizing states to develop these pre-approved project mitigation plans and restructure disaster mitigation into formula grants. So right now, the BRIC program is competitive based. That means communities that have higher capacity to go through the application process tend to be more favored in the selection of actual granting of projects. And communities that are have lower capacity or more marginalized that don't really have the capacity and ability to apply for the grants, even with direct technical assistance from FEMA, tend to miss out. And so what this bill would do is make it grant-based, so communities could have more equity in terms of equality in terms of how they can get the funding they need to make themselves more resilient to future disasters that would reduce the impact on taxpayers and helping them recover. There's also in things there about modifying disaster cost sharing frameworks. So there's a lot of aspects of the bill that would actually encourage states and communities to step up and do more, to take on more responsibility to reduce their risk in the first place by giving them a better cost share preferential for taking certain actions. So right now, with the public assistance program, for example, 75% of the funding is covered by the federal government and 25% is covered by the state or locality for a particular project. This might change that based on what that community or that state does. So if they improve their building codes, if they create a rainy day fund, if they take other actions to reduce their risk, they could get a better cost share in that distribution of aid. And so it's really encouraging states and localities to step up and do more. I know that we want to leave about 10 minutes for questions, and it's already about 11 or 12:20 on the East Coast. And so I think I'll stop there and really happy to answer questions and get into some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. That was a great presentation. And as a reminder, I don't think I said this actually at the beginning, but all of this will be posted online, eesi.org. So you'll be able to go back and rewatch Joel's presentation, review presentation materials, and we'll even post some highlight bullets too to make this all very skimmable. Joel, that was a great presentation, and we have some questions coming in, and this was one that was mentioned in the Mentimeter responses as well. But I'd like to start with a question. How is what we'll call the lapse in appropriations, the government shutdown, how is the lapse in appropriations impacting FEMA, including the National Flood Insurance Program? And is that yet having any impacts on communities or relying on disaster aid or recovery help or people trying to access NFIP?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think there's a lot of factors that come together with the lapse in appropriations that have resulted in FEMA aid being slowed and its ability to reach the communities that it needs. With the lapse in appropriations, while there's still FEMA staff that are employed in doing response, the ability to do so has been reduced because of just like a reduction in capacity of the amount of staff that needs to be on the ground. And that comes not only from the lapse of appropriations, but from reductions in force and other aspects that have really hampered FEMA's ability to respond quickly. As far as the National Flood Insurance Program goes, that also lapsed when the appropriations ran out on September 30th. And because of that, FEMA is not allowed to sell or renew policies. So that means if you are a home buyer and you are looking to secure a new policy, you're not going to be able to get it through the NFIP, which can either really slow down your real estate transaction or in some cases stop it completely if the bank's not willing to close without NFIP coverage. Because under federal law, if you are securing a federally backed mortgage in a flood zone, you must carry flood insurance. And while sometimes the private sector can step in, it's still nascent, and the private flood insurance sector is still nascent. And so NFIP really is the only game in town. And so that really can have an impact on communities to be safe if a storm comes through and their residents aren't able to get flood insurance.
Thanks for that clarification. Another set of questions that are coming in, several people have asked questions, some version of this question. What has the FEMA Review Council been up to? Have there been any opportunities for the public to engage, either with comments? Can you give us a status update about where that stands and maybe
Sure.
have any thoughts about what people should be watching for from the Review Council?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the Review Council was established by executive order early in the spring, and it was set up to look at how to reform the agency. It's comprised of multiple stakeholders, including the DHS secretary, as well as the Secretary of Defense, and multiple state stakeholders, from governors to locality representatives. And it's been, in my opinion, a little slow in how it's approaching looking at how to reform FEMA. They've had a few meetings over the summer where you were allowed to weigh in as the public official, or as a member of the public, I should say, with requests for what the agent or the review council should focus on. And there was a couple meetings where you can go to the FEMA website and find the minutes of those meetings, but not much substance was covered. What we're really going to see at the end is a report that should be coming out probably around end of December with their recommendations. What's in that report is still very black box, I would say. There's not much that's been put out what it would actually cover. But I think, running parallel with that is the actions that are happening in Congress with the FEMA Act. And that's something that I think is really more likely to have an impact.
So that is a great segue to the other really popular question that people are asking, and that is FEMA Act. It's making progress. It's always great when these things are bipartisan. It has the support of the chairman and the ranking member. Do you have any thoughts about maybe some timelines or some mileposts for things that we might be on the lookout for as the FEMA Act continues to make its way through the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the FEMA Act, as I mentioned, passed out of committee back, I think, in beginning of September. And I think, given what's happening right now in Congress with the shutdown, that not much is going to happen. But once that's over, I see this moving forward again. It's a great bipartisan effort, a lot of support on both sides. Like every bipartisan bill, there's things that we like, that we don't like, but it's a good compromise. And I see it, moving forward in the House. The next step would be for a companion bill to be introduced in the Senate, or for this one to go to the Senate. That I don't have much information on. If there's anyone in the Senate that's looking to do a companion bill, and then it's unclear how the administration might react. But I think because there's a lot of bipartisan support for it, and it's been a very inclusive effort, that over the summer, both the ranking member and the chair had reached out and asked for public input. They issued drafts of the bill and then asked for input on that before they even introduced the official text. I think there's a good possibility that this moves forward and has a lot of benefit for reforming FEMA to be more efficient.
So you mentioned that there's no current Senate companion to the FEMA Act. Are there any other bipartisan, or not, and are there any other legislative efforts, whether it's authorizations or appropriations? Are there any other legislative efforts moving around in Congress that are related to this that people should be watchful of?
That's a great question. I don't know other bills that are moving right now that I think have the same legs as the FEMA Act. There's a lot of bills that have been introduced, from looking at how to reform, I think, the provision of disaster aid, to looking at how to make insurance more affordable. But I think the FEMA Act is one of the bills that, because it's bipartisan and has been really vetted, is more likely to be the vehicle that people should pay attention to.
Another question that has come in a couple different forms and is kind of related to I think one of the provisions of the FEMA Act is the idea of shoot, where did it just go? It was right here. Oh yeah. The idea, and you mentioned this in your presentation as well, the ability for aid to be distributed equitably based on need and not other considerations that I think they've been in the news a little bit, unfortunately lately. What are the protections in the FEMA Act? Are there other protections that Congress should be thinking about to ensure that FEMA assistance isn't politicized and that communities, regardless of where they are, but they get the support on the front end and on the back end when they need it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it definitely has been in the news lately with aid appearing to be politicized, and certain states getting assistance and others not for similar events. I think one of the things that the FEMA Act does well is that it puts stronger requirements on the administrator to have this emergency management background and professionalism to make sure that who's ever in charge of FEMA understands exactly what it needs to do to help communities and states. I think another aspect of the FEMA Act that could be altered is that some of the hazard mitigation programs that have been politicized, like the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program or the BRIC program, there's a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Ambiguity, I guess, as to how those must be stood up. And if there's under the Stafford Act, a lot of it's may, or it doesn't have the same type of gravitas that saying this program should be stood up. So if the FEMA Act could change some of the mays to shalls under the Stafford Act, that's clear that once this disaster hits and public assistance is going out the door, hazard mitigation grant funding needs to go out the door too, because otherwise we're just rebuilding to the status quo. We're not encouraging mitigation to reduce future risk and reducing future exposure for taxpayers. So I think that's one area, and that would also help with, I think, some of the politicization is making it clear that this has to happen. It's not just a matter of if it's up to the administrator or up to the president. So.
You mentioned hazard mitigation and BRIC, which is a program. I think the DRRA, the disaster recovery, whatever, of the 2018 legislation.
Yeah.
Could you explain what the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities Grant Program? I know that one, when that one was hit, unfortunately, it made some headlines as well. But could you briefly explain what that program does and why it's valuable?
Absolutely. So the BRIC program was set up, as you said, to the DRRA during the first Trump administration, and it was really designed to help communities reduce risk on a large scale, and looking at hazards more holistically and how they could prepare for future disaster events. And it was designed kind of in response to some earlier programs that had been set up by HUD and during special appropriations in response to disasters. This is meant to be more of a permanent program. And what it does is it provides on a competitive basis grants to communities to basically look at large-scale infrastructure projects they can do to reduce their risk. So one of the projects that was being currently done was looking in the state of Oregon to help this hospital basically become a shelter for tsunamis. It's in a community that's really rural, hospital's old, and this one of the BRIC programs would have been making sure that could be a recovery center to help people can congregate during a disaster and stay safe. That program has been canceled by the current administration, and there's some litigation around it as to making sure that the funding for the program, the way it's set up is that 6% of the whatever the funding is for public assistance and individual assistance also has to be applied to BRIC. It stays in that BRIC fund and can be distributed accordingly. And so I think right now with the current administration canceling that, it's going to have a huge impact on multiple parties, not just blue states or red states. It's across the board. So many communities benefited from the BRIC program, and it really was meant to actually reduce taxpayer exposure by making sure that future disasters weren't as severe. And so we didn't have to put out so much money in recovery, but we could reduce it in the first place.
I got tripped up on the acronym, but it is is the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. So no disrespect to the bill, to the legislation. I just got my R's mixed up. Are there any provisions in the FEMA Act that deal with BRIC, either or BRIC-ish programs?
Yeah, so there's one provision in the FEMA Act that would make BRIC a grant-based program instead of a formula-based, or a grant-based program instead of a competitive program. The formula that's in the legislation kind of like tries to put more emphasis on, I think, communities, like localities and rural communities. I think under the BRIC program, going from a competitive program to a grant-based program would be helpful, especially for lower capacity communities that just don't have the ability to compete against like your like Houston's or your Los Angeles for these grants. One of the things I think would be interesting is making the formula that's put forward in the bill maybe up for more input because I think it's a good first start, but like looking at how we really make sure it's tailored to make sure that the communities that need the assistance most get it. And so, but that's one big thing that the FEMA Act does is that it overhauls the BRIC program to make it more basically equitable.
I think we have time for one last one, and this is one that someone emailed us about, and I think because I haven't seen much reporting about this at all in the
Mhm.
media. The idea of the lapse in appropriations affecting NFIP and
Mhm.
that impeding home sales, which is an unintended consequence, I'm sure. The question is, are you aware of any places in the country where the buyers where home buyers are taking sort of the responsibility away from the sellers? Or do you have any other? Can you add anything
Hmm.
more to what you were saying before about the availability of NFIP and what that's dealing and what that effect that's having on home sales?
Yeah, so in this shutdown, it's a little different than when it happened several years ago because in 2022, I believe there were some changes to the mandatory purchase agreement or requirement that said that banks, if they chose, could still close on the real estate transaction if the buyer didn't have flood insurance coverage, and then they would just backdate it once the insurance became available. So that's allowed some transactions to go forward if banks are willing to do that. But if banks aren't willing to take that risk, then the sales are not going through, and it's really I think slowing down real estate transactions in comparison to like how they normally would appear. I mean, it's not complete prohibition. We also have this time around more private insurance available, but that's still not available in all areas, and unlike the NFIP. And so, depending on where you live in the country and risk tolerance of the bank you're working with, it can be really hard sometimes to close when the NFIP is not operating well, especially if you are already an existing homeowner and you want to renew your policy that's about to expire. That can be really problematic because then you're looking at a situation where you can't renew and you might have to go to the private market, and it's not clear if you can go to the private market and come back to the NFIP. So for existing homeowners, it's I think even a little more unnerving because they already own their home. They are the ones that are going to be hit hard if there's a flood event, and their insurance is expired. Because even though the insurance across the country is still pretty low for uptake of NFIP, it's really the main game in town. And that's something that yeah, I think really needs to be considered when looking at how to perform FEMA and just the NFIP in general.
Thank you for that, Joel. Tremendous presentation. Any resources, plugs, whether for NRDC resources that you rely on? This is a rapid readout. We can't cover
Mhm.
everything, but do you have any resources that you might recommend to our audience for people who want to stay up to date with how this is playing out?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think one of the resources that I use quite frequently is actually from the Carnegie Endowment, and it's a tracker of disaster aid and how disaster aid has increased over the years and how it's actually been impacted in the last couple of years, so especially the last year, in terms of how it's going out the door, and gives a really good indication of where it's impacting communities, which communities get the most disaster aid, and which communities also could look at how to encourage and increase resilience. And so I think that's a great resource and a fairly nonpartisan one.
Thank you, Joel. This was such a great presentation. Thank you for joining us today for this rapid readout, the future of FEMA. I have to say, everyone in our online audience today, like an order of magnitude more questions than we normally. We usually get quite a bit of questions, but like an order of magnitude more
Great.
questions. So you stimulated lots of thoughts, and I think actually we got to the vast majority of them, at least in terms of
Awesome.
topics asked about. So thank you, Joel, for joining us today. We really, really appreciate it. If anyone in our online audience would like to go back and rewatch Joel's presentation or review slides or review the highlight notes from the briefing today, you can do that by visiting us online at eesi.org. I hope you'll also take an opportunity to sign up for our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. Next issue comes out next week. We also, during the COP30, the UN climate negotiations that are about to happen in Brazil, we'll also be doing a daily newsletter, or mostly daily newsletter, called COP30 Dispatch. And it's really oriented toward a congressional audience to help folks on Capitol Hill keep up with what's happening and help them answer questions from their bosses. COP30 is one of those things where it'll happen for a couple weeks. Everyone will pay very close attention to it, and we'll be bringing a lot of expert voices to the table and tracking things pretty comprehensively to hopefully make it easier to follow developments. And speaking of that, we have 3 briefings next week. The first of the 3 briefings is about the climate negotiations and the process itself. That's on Tuesday, November 4th. And then following that, we'll have a briefing on Wednesday about the global cooling pledge, which will be a major topic of conversation and discussion, and also an opportunity for lots of the subnational actors and the corporate sector actors who participate or observe in the negotiations to participate as well. And then we'll do one on Thursday about international trade and climate policy. So you can subscribe to all of those things, RSVP for all of those if you visit us online at eesi.org. The last thing that we'll do is post a quick slide here with a survey. This is separate from the Mentimeter, so don't think you've already done it. If you have any feedback for our presentation today, our rapid readout, you can use this link to take our survey. We read every response. It only takes a minute or 2 to submit. If you have any questions about future topics or ideas for future topics, if you have any issues with the live cast or the audio or whatever, we really appreciate everyone who takes a moment to share what they thought. Joel, again, thank you so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Happy Halloween. If you're trick-or-treating, I hope you get lots of your favorite candy. And we'll be back next week for our COP30 briefings. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.